In the silence of the night, it whispers of the past. Subscribe to hear its voice and never lose your place in the story. You know, sometimes the most valuable lessons aren't in dusty books or complicated equations. They're in the quiet, practical wisdom of people who lived long before electricity, running water, or even the idea of indoor plumbing. So before we journey back, settle in. Let the lights fade low, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something oddly comforting about knowing these stories are circling the globe, drifting into living rooms, bedrooms, and maybe even the occasional candlelit cabin. In the medieval world, fire wasn't just a tool, it was the heartbeat of survival. It gave warmth on nights when the wind howled through thatched walls, cooked every meal worth eating, lit the darkness when shadows grew too thick, and stood guard when wolves, both the four-legged and two-legged kind, prowled near. You didn't pack snacks when you traveled, you carried fire itself. Imagine a humble ember, glowing like a trapped star, tucked into a bundle of dried moss, fungus, or soft punkwood. Sometimes it was cradled inside a hollowed horn or wrapped in a pouch treated with saltpeter or animal fat so it would smolder for hours, even a day. A little breath, a bit of coaxing, and that ember would spring to life, ready for warmth, for cooking, for keeping the dark at bay. It was the medieval version of a pocket lighter, though far slower, far smokier, and far more dangerous if you were careless. Carrying fire meant you could arrive in an empty clearing, gather a few sticks, whisper a prayer to whatever saint you trusted most, and watch the flames rise without the misery of striking flint in freezing winds until your fingers curled into claws. It was a gift you could pass to a neighbor heading to market, a gesture of trust and kinship in a world where arriving home without fire meant more than just inconvenience. It meant real danger. And while modern survivalists fill shelves with jars, vacuum-sealed packets, and mystery tins, medieval families had their own quiet genius. Meat wasn't preserved for taste, it was preserved for life. The method? Not the fragrant, gentle curl of a backyard grill, but thick, resin-heavy smoke born from pine or other woods, the kind that seeped into rafters, clothes, and skin. Meat wasn't hung proudly above the flames. It was hidden behind the fire, high in the shadows, where the cool smoke rose in slow, steady currents. Over weeks or months, it dried and hardened, repelling insects and slowing decay until it could last deep into winter's lean months. This was survival smoke, sharp, bitter, and honest. It wrapped itself around every cut, every joint, building a quiet wall between hunger and survival. And the placement wasn't just about preservation, it was about protection. Hidden meat was harder to steal, which mattered in villages where, "I didn't notice your sausage there," could pass for a legal excuse. All the while, the slow burn warmed the home, kept pests away, and turned the air into something between a shield and a promise. And when it came to protecting land, crops, and animals, medieval people didn't always turn to wooden fences or watchtowers. They grew their defenses. Living fences, rows of tightly planted willows, hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn, were woven and trained into thick, thorny walls. The branches were bent and interlaced until they formed barriers that could turn aside wandering livestock, discourage thieves, and if you had the courage, or foolishness, to try picking their berries, leave your hands scratched and stinging. These hedgerows didn't weaken with time. They strengthened, each season adding new layers of defense. They weren't just walls. They were living guardians, rooted deep in the soil, shaped by human patience and nature's own stubbornness. So as you drift into the soft edges of sleep, picture it, a hidden ember tucked safe in your pack, a hem quietly smoking in the rafters, and a living wall growing stronger with every passing day. The tools of survival were never just about the present moment. They were about building something that would last, something that could outwait storms, winters, and even the years themselves. You might think of a fence as something plain and functional, but in the medieval countryside, some barriers were alive, quite literally. Instead of rotting timber that collapsed into the mud and invited every carpenter in town to offer a special price, people planted their walls. Year after year, those hedgerows thickened, grew denser, and became nearly impenetrable. Farmers weren't simply marking boundaries, they were cultivating living fortresses. These walls sang with life. birds nested in them, bees buzzed happily through the blossoms, and the roots held the soil steady against the wind. They were as useful as they were beautiful, a medieval multi-tool with thorns, honey, and sometimes the suspicious rustle of a hidden animal. Some hedgerows in England still stand today, their tangled roots over 700 years old, quiet witnesses that have outlasted kings, wars, and centuries of change. Now, when you hear the phrase clay battery, you might imagine something buzzing with electricity. But this medieval marvel had nothing to do with lightning and everything to do with mastering the warmth of a summer afternoon or the cool breath of winter. Clay was more than the stuff of pots and crude figurines. It was nature's own thermal vault. Its magic lay in how it stubbornly clung to heat or cold, holding on to it like an old storyteller holds onto a favorite tale. Picture it. In summer, clay-lined storage pits and vessels kept food cool, like a quiet underground breeze. In winter, those same clay walls released the day's warmth slowly, stretching comfort into the coldest hours. People stored milk, butter, even stew in unglazed clay pots soaked with water. As the moisture evaporated, the contents cooled, a simple yet ingenious refrigerator humming without a sound. Others buried clay jars in shaded earth, letting the steady underground temperature protect their food from spoilage. And on cold nights, clay bricks warmed near a fire would be wrapped in cloth and slipped into beds or wagons. A primitive hot water bottle, only without the risk of spilling. At worst, the clay might crack. At best, it cradled warmth until morning. And in kitchens where no one had ever heard of non-stick pans, people found their own solution. Long before any miracle coating was marketed to home cooks, medieval potters created something called friction glaze, a smooth, semi-polished finish made entirely by hand. Pots were often formed from coarse clay, rough enough to grab and hold onto every scrap of food like a miser clutches coins. But by rubbing the damp clay with smooth stones, bone tools, or hardwood, craftsmen compressed the surface, sealing the pores and aligning the particles until the pot gleamed faintly. This was burnishing, half artistry, half stubborn persistence. Was it perfect? Hardly. A stubborn stew could still cling to the sides like a guest who wouldn't leave. But it reduced sticking enough to make cleaning bearable, and sometimes the potters sealed the finish with a layer of animal fat before firing, creating a primitive version of seasoning. The result was cookware that lasted longer, resisted cracks, and carried a subtle sheen, a kind of medieval kitchen treasure. In a world where most household objects were plain or worn, a polished cooking pot wasn't just useful, it was a small piece of beauty in everyday life. Travel in those days brought its own set of challenges, and one of the most overlooked skills was navigating without sight. On mornings when mist rolled so thick you couldn't see the end of your cart, you relied on your ears. Villagers could recognize their own home by the tone and direction of the church bell, or gauge their location by the faint rumble of a millstone turning in the distance. The barking of dogs wasn't just background noise, it was a signal telling you how far you'd wandered and which path might lead you home. This was the art of sound navigation, a skill shaped by necessity and sharpened by experience. Without maps in your pocket or a glowing arrow to follow, you listened to the world. Every echo of hammer on anvil, every rush of water over stones, every faint human voice carried meaning. You were part of a living landscape where sounds stitched the world together, guiding you through fog, forest, and unfamiliar fields until the familiar rhythm of home returned. And so, when you think of the Middle Ages, don't just picture castles and battles. Imagine hedgerows that grow stronger with each season, clay jars keeping milk cool in the heat, pots polished smooth by patient hands, and travelers navigating by the quiet language of sound. These weren't just survival tricks, they were threads of a way of life woven into the fabric of centuries, carrying the same message we can still feel today. The simplest tools, when tended with care, can outlast storms, winters, and even time itself. You find yourself in a fog so thick it swallows the world, the path ahead vanishing into a gray curtain. With no compass, no map, and no friendly landmark in sight, you turn to the oldest guide humanity ever had, sound. In the Middle Ages, the air itself carried directions if you knew how to listen. The deep, steady toll of a church bell could cut through mist for miles. not just to call the faithful to prayer but to tell weary travelers, civilization is near. Out in the fields, herds wore bells not only so their owners could keep track of wandering livestock, but so you could follow their music home. Though sometimes, you risked ending up in the wrong pasture, greeted by a very confused neighbor. In certain regions, people went further, hanging chimes, drums, or even clanging pots along woodland paths and mountain passes. A metallic rattle on the breeze meant you were on a trail that someone had walked before, and maybe survived. Along the coast, fishermen used horns and the bounce of echoes to feel their way into hidden harbors. Even taverns played their part, their music and chatter spilling into the night like beacons of warmth, food, and familiar faces. If you followed the melody, you'd find firelight and shelter, and possibly a cousin asleep under the nearest bench. Of course, finding your way was one thing, keeping your teeth in your head was another. Without toothpaste or floss, medieval people turned to something far simpler, far grittier: charcoal. Burned wood, crushed into powder and mixed with salt, herbs, or crushed shells, became their tooth scrub. It wasn't gentle. Rubbing ash against your teeth felt exactly as rough as it sounds, but it polished enamel, scraped away buildup, and if you were lucky, delayed tooth loss a little longer. Sometimes mint, rosemary, or sage was added, not because it transformed the cleaning power, but because it gave the illusion of freshness. Compared to the alternative, a violent extraction at the hands of the village dentist, who was often also the local knife sharpener, charcoal seemed like mercy. And while modern homes stand on concrete and drywall, medieval houses often began as little more than sticks, mud, straw, and stubborn hope. The technique was called wattle and daub, a weaving of supple branches between sturdy posts, forming a frame like a tall basket. Over this, a mixture of mud, straw, clay, and yes, animal dung, was pressed in by hand until every gap was sealed. Once dry, these walls kept out the wind, held in heat, and bore the scent of the earth itself. They weren't glamorous, and they required constant upkeep, cracks patched, flaking repaired, but they could stand for centuries if cared for. In fact, some wattle walls from the 14th century are still standing, proof that a peasant's work could outlast kings. Yet perhaps the most quietly beautiful survival trick of the medieval home came at night. Imagine a bed stuffed with straw, the roof above dripping from last night's rain, and the air alive with the threat of biting pests. The answer wasn't luxury, it was herb-laced bedding. Lavender, mint, wormwood, rosemary, plants chosen for their scent and their power to drive away fleas, lice, and other unwelcome bedfellows. As you lay down, the fragrance rose with the warmth of your body, weaving through the air like a natural lullaby. It was part comfort, part shield, and entirely a reminder that survival wasn't only about enduring, it was also about finding small ways to rest in peace. So picture it now, a night so thick with fog you can only trust the bells, a morning scrubbed awake with charcoal and mint, a home built from earth and willpower, and a bed that smells of herbs and safety. This was the rhythm of medieval life, a blend of hardship and ingenuity, where every solution carried both necessity and a touch of quiet grace. You know that stuffing your bed with plain straw in the Middle Ages was like putting up a welcome sign for every crawling, biting guest in the area. The smart households had a trick. They laced their bedding with herbs. Not for comfort, but for battle. Lavender, mint, wormwood, pennyroyal, rosemary, plants whose scents were so strong they drove away fleas, lice, mosquitoes, and sometimes even your spouse. Some, like tansy or rue, were believed to ward off not just pests but darker things, spirits, bad dreams, even the occasional ill-willed visitor. Whether or not those beliefs held true, the result was the same. A bed that smelled like an oddly pleasant garden and kept the night's worst intruders at bay, at least for a little while. After a few nights, you'd have to refresh the herbs, or risk being woken by something tiny, hungry, and determined. But the habit didn't stop with mattresses. People scattered herbs across their floors, wove them into door frames, and hung fragrant bundles over sleeping spaces. A home might look half like an apothecary, half like a forest shrine, but it was cleaner, safer, and much better smelling than the neighbor's goat shed. Entire handwritten guides detailed which plants worked best, and some swore that dreams themselves were sweeter under the scent of lavender. Science may be uncertain, but if it helped you forget the damp roof and the fact your pillow was a sack of oats, it was worth believing. Keeping food fresh in those days required just as much ingenuity. Long before the hum of a refrigerator, there were stone cooling shelves, slabs of slate or marble built right into the shaded north walls of homes. The stone, kissed by the cool air and the steady temperature of the earth, created a quiet oasis for milk, butter, and whatever was left from the last meal. In cooler months, it kept food fresh for days. In summer, it still held its chill better than the air around it. No humming motor, no glowing light, just the patience of stone, the shadow of the wall, and a little hope. In wealthy homes, these shelves might be paired with damp cloths or porous jars of water to add an extra cooling effect. Poorer families had simpler methods. Just set the milk on the slab and pray it wouldn't turn before breakfast. Some homes even dedicated entire rooms to this purpose, their thick walls and earthen floors acting as natural cold storage. They were the ancestors of root cellars, and their design was born not from luxury, but from the sheer will to make food last in a world where waste could be deadly. And when it came to medicine, creativity took a different form. If you were stung, bruised, swollen, or suffering from aches, you might reach today for ice packs or pills. But in the Middle Ages, one of the simplest remedies came from the garden, the humble cabbage leaf. It was cool, flexible, and naturally antimicrobial. Crushed gently to release its juices, a leaf could be wrapped around an injury to draw out heat, soothe swelling, and calm pain. For chest congestion or aching joints, the leaves could be warmed, turning them into a kind of herbal compress. No bloodletting, no chanting over strange instruments, just the quiet comfort of a leaf and thyme. It worked because cabbage retained moisture and transferred its coolness, or warmth, slowly. Some healers swore by it, and while it wasn't a miracle cure, it was a relief that cost nothing but the effort to grow or barter for the vegetable. In leaner times, when the pain eased, the leaf might even find its way into the stew pot. Waste not, want not. So picture the scene. You're lying in a bed that smells of mint and lavender, the night air cool against your face. In the corner, a slab of stone quietly guards tomorrow's butter from spoiling. A cabbage leaf rests over a sore knee, drawing out the ache, while somewhere outside, the summer insects hum, unaware that they've been locked out by the faintest line of scent. It's not comfort in the way we think of it today, but in a world of candles, earth walls, and the constant hum of survival, these were the small victories that made life possible. You live in a time before the hum of electric bulbs, before the soft glow of a bedside lamp, and before anyone could simply flip a switch to push back the night. For most people, candles were a luxury reserved for churches or the wealthy. In your home, light came from something humbler and far less glamorous, the rush light. Imagine walking through marshy ground, gathering long, thin rush plants, drying them under the sun, peeling them to reveal their pale inner core, and then soaking them in whatever animal fat your household could spare. Bacon drippings, mutton tallow, goose grease, nothing went to waste. Once lit, they burned with a faint sputter, sending out more smell than charm. But for a few precious minutes, 10 maybe 30, they gave you enough glow to sew a seam, check a pot, or find your way to bed. If you needed more light, you simply lit another. Rush lights were more than illumination. They were timers in a world without clocks. Boil a pot, for half a rush light's burn, and you had a recipe. Count how many it took for someone to return from the alehouse, and you had a measure of their absence. They were cheap, easy to make, and sustainable, provided you didn't mind your home smelling faintly of fried fat and marsh water. And while the rush light kept the dark at bay, other clever methods kept food from turning foul. One of the strangest involved looking at a bog, a cold, murky expanse of peat, and deciding it was the perfect place to bury butter. It sounds absurd, yet bog butter was a tried and true storage method. The bog's cold, oxygen-poor, acidic environment was nature's preservation chamber, capable of keeping dairy edible for months or even years. People wrapped butter or lard in cloth, bark, or even sealed wooden vessels before sinking it deep into the peat. Why go to such lengths? Because food was wealth. A stash of butter in a bog could be winter rations, a form of tribute, or a way to keep your valuables from thieves, After all, who would willingly dig through freezing, knee-deep muck for someone else's breakfast? Centuries later, archaeologists have unearthed bog butter that's over 3,000 years old. Modern tasters describe it as smoky, cheesy, and overwhelmingly earthy, proof that time leaves its own flavor. But not every solution was so elaborate. Sometimes, storage was as simple as finding a hollow tree. Across the countryside, natural cavities formed by age, storms, or insects became ready-made pantries. Shade, insulation, and concealment all in one. You could tuck away apples, dried meat, or cheese, safe from the sun and from the neighbor's goat. Travelers used them too, leaving supplies hidden in the woods for the return journey. Some lined the hollows with moss or leaves to keep things dry. Others placed their goods in ceramic jars before hiding them away, if only to ensure they weren't nibbled by the tree's smaller residents. And then there was bark bread, a last resort when famine bit deep. In those desperate times, people turned to the forest not for game, which could be scarce, but for the very trees themselves. They stripped away the rough outer bark of pine, birch, or elm to reach the soft inner layer known as cambium. This was dried, ground, and mixed with whatever grain could be spared to make a dense, chewy bread. It wasn't pleasant. It tasted faintly of the forest floor and carried a bitterness that spoke of hunger, but it could fill a stomach and keep someone alive when nothing else would. So imagine it now. You're seated in a dim room lit by a sputtering rushlight, its faint glow just enough to see the steam from your bark bread. Outside, somewhere in the bog, a bundle of butter waits for the months ahead, hidden in the cold embrace of the peat. Nearby, a hollow tree holds tomorrow's cheese, safe in its wooden vault. These weren't conveniences, they were lifelines. And in the medieval world, survival was built on small, clever victories like these, each one a quiet triumph against the dark, the cold, and the relentless march of hunger. You know, hunger in the Middle Ages didn't just test your body, it tested your imagination. When the grain bins ran empty, taxes pressed hard, and the cows gave no milk, people didn't simply give up. They looked to the forest not for meat or berries, but for the very skin of the trees. Bark bread was born from desperation, yet it kept countless people alive. The trick was to peel away the outer shell and reach the cambium, the soft, pale inner layer beneath. Dried, ground, and mixed with whatever could be spared, acorns, nettles, or a rare scoop of real flour, it became a flat, chewy loaf. It didn't taste like comfort food, it tasted like the woods themselves. But in a world where the choice was bark bread or no bread, you chose the tree. Some roasted the bark first to bring out a smoky note, a flavor that masked the bitterness and made swallowing easier. This wasn't just a peasant's dish. During sieges and brutal winters, whole towns relied on it. In some places, there were even rules about how much bark could be taken from communal forests. Too much, and the trees died. Too little, and the people did. It was a grim balancing act. So if the world ever leaves you standing in the woods with an empty stomach, remember, a birch can be more than shade. Now, leave the cold forests behind and step into the warmth of ancient Mesopotamia, where beauty was more than vanity. It was a kind of devotion. Here, grooming wasn't just about looking presentable for your neighbors. It was about preparing yourself for the gaze of the gods. Men and women alike painted their eyes with bold lines of kohl long before Cleopatra made it famous, crafted from a dark powder of minerals like lead, copper, and antimony. They believed it could shield the eyes from evil spirits and even soften the glare of the desert sun. Their skin care would impress even the most demanding modern influencer. Mud from the riverbanks, rich with minerals, was smeared over the skin in cooling layers, then scraped away to leave a smooth, luminous surface. Crushed gemstones mixed into oils served as exfoliants. Even hair removal had divine undertones. Sharpened seashells, primitive tweezers, or gentle burning left the skin hairless and closer to perfection. To them, refinement and cleanliness mirrored the order of the heavens. Scent played a role too. Myrrh, frankincense, cedar, fragrances infused into oils, were rubbed into the skin, not just for pleasure but for spiritual purity. In royal courts, such perfumes were treasures, given as tribute and stored like gold. Even brows were shaped with permanence in mind, tattooed with soot or plant dyes to frame the face with bold, unchanging arches. Fast forward to Cleopatra's Egypt and Rome's fever for luxury. The legendary queen wasn't only a ruler, she was a living symbol of beauty's power. The famed milk baths, whether truth or myth, made sense. Lactic acid in sour milk softens and renews the skin. Roman elites followed her lead, bathing in milk, honey, and rose petals, believing it could erase years from their faces. For them, pale skin wasn't just a preference, it was a badge of wealth. White lead powder painted across cheeks and forehead gave that flawless, ghostly finish, though over time it poisoned the very women who wore it. Red ochre, crushed mulberries, even powdered insects became rouge and lip stain. Eyeliner and brows were shaped with soot and animal fat. And for hair, curling rods and dyes were in constant use. Blondes were especially prized, with wigs woven from the hair of conquered lands. Then, across the world in dynastic China, beauty took a different path. Here, refinement wasn't about excess, but harmony. The ideal complexion was pale as porcelain, not to mimic illness, but to show you lived a life of leisure, far from the sun-baked fields. White powders, crushed pearls, and herbal washes were part of daily rituals. Every detail, from the slope of the brow to the smoothness of the skin, was shaped with patience and a quiet pursuit of balance. So whether you picture bark bread eaten in a freezing hut or a queen soaking in rose-scented milk, the thread is the same. Human beings, in every age, turned to nature and ingenuity to survive, to adorn, and to transform. Some methods fed the body, others fed the spirit, but all left their mark on history, whispering that survival and beauty have always been two sides of the same story. You walk into a palace of the Han Dynasty, and beauty is everywhere, but not in the loud, glittering sense. Here, refinement is quiet and deliberate, a balance of discipline, artistry, and symbolism. Pale, porcelain-like skin is the ideal, not to shun the sun in fear, but to show the world you live a life of leisure, untouched by the harsh labor of the fields. To achieve it, women used powders made from ground rice, white lead, and crushed pearl. These weren't simply cosmetics. Many formulas were designed by court physicians, believed to nourish the body, strengthen the spirit, and even extend life. And then there was jade, the stone of immortality. Cool against the skin, smooth as flowing water, jade was more than beautiful, it was sacred. Women rolled it across their faces to encourage circulation, ease puffiness, and preserve youth. Emperors, too, trusted in its magic, resting their heads on jade pillows at night, convinced the stone would draw out toxins as they slept. Eyebrows were their own language. In one dynasty, they arched long and sweeping, in another, short and sharp. Ink made from burnt willow or charcoal was brushed into shape with rabbit hair tools, sometimes applied to brows, other times painted high on the forehead after the natural ones were removed, an attempt to look more divine than human. Lips were tinted with cinnabar and animal fat, given a soft sheen with beeswax. Cheeks bloomed with safflower rouge, dabbed in perfect circles. Tiny painted dots near the lips or eyes, delicate, intentional, spoke of charm and mystery. Hair was an act of devotion. Washed with fermented rice water and nourished with camellia oil, it grew long enough to brush the knees. Styled into intricate knots and waves, secured with jade pins or gold combs, it was a crown in itself, a declaration of status, grace, and cultural mastery. To the ancient Chinese, beauty was a form of quiet power, an art that revealed itself in subtle harmony rather than excess. Then the scene shifts to the Renaissance courts of Italy, England, and France, where beauty could be as dangerous as a blade. Here, pale skin wasn't just admired, it was worshipped. To achieve it, women turned to Venetian sars, a paste of white lead and vinegar. Under candlelight, it made skin luminous and flawless, hiding every imperfection. But the glow came at a cost: corrosion, paralysis, tooth decay, even death. Still, the pursuit of perfection outweighed the price. Those who wanted to erase freckles or brighten their complexion sometimes swallowed arsenic wafers, tiny, deadly promises of a translucent glow. Eyebrows were thinned to fine arches or removed entirely. High foreheads were a mark of intelligence and grace. so women shaved their hairlines, sacrificing comfort for fashion. Rouge came from crushed berries, cochineal insects, or vermilion, painted on cheeks and lips alike, sometimes using mercury-based dyes that added a brilliant pop of color along with nerve damage. And when scent was needed to hide the lack of frequent bathing, ambergris, musk, and civet were worn like invisible cloaks. In Italy, golden hair was the pinnacle of beauty. Women lightened their locks with mixtures of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice, then sat in the sun under wide hats with open crowns, letting the rays bleach their hair while their skin stayed pale. It worked, but it burned the scalp and left the air tinged with the smell of chemicals. And then, far to the east, in ancient India, beauty was inseparable from wellness. It was Ayurveda, the science of life, woven into every gesture of self-care. A bath was more than cleansing, it was a sacred ritual. Women bathed in water infused with turmeric or milk, then exfoliated with upton, a golden paste of chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rosewater. This didn't just smooth and brighten the skin, it was believed to slow aging and cleanse the body's energy. Hair, the crowning glory, was treated with devotion. Warm coconut oil infused with amla, hibiscus, or other herbs was massaged into the scalp, strengthening roots and adding luster. The oiling was both a beauty treatment and an act of healing, calming the mind while feeding the hair. Every step, every scent, was chosen not only for appearance, but for harmony, balance, and the deep connection between body and spirit. Across all these worlds, from jade rollers gliding over powdered faces, to lead paint gleaming in candlelight, to golden oils soaking into hair, beauty was never just about appearance. It was a language, a power, a reflection of the values and beliefs that shaped entire cultures. And like the people who practiced them, these rituals whisper their stories across time, some filled with wisdom, others with warning, all reminding us that the pursuit of beauty has always been as much about who we are as how we look. You sit in a quiet courtyard in ancient India, the air fragrant with jasmine and rose. Beauty here is not rushed. It is a ritual, a reflection of inner balance as much as outward grace. Hair oiling is as sacred as prayer. Warm coconut oil infused with amla, hibiscus, or herbs is massaged into the scalp, not just to encourage growth, but to calm the mind and guard against early graying. Thick, waist-length hair is more than an ornament. It is a living symbol of vitality, femininity, and good fortune. These sessions are intimate, often shared among mothers, daughters, and sisters, the soft rhythm of fingers against the scalp carrying both comfort and connection. Eyes are framed with kajal, a deep black liner made from soot and ghee. It is said to shield against the evil eye, protecting both beauty and spirit. Mothers apply it not only to themselves but to their infants, a gesture that is as much about love as it is tradition. In the markets of cities like Kannauj, the air is heavy with adders, perfumed oils distilled from jasmine, rose, vetiver. These are not simply scents for allure. They are meant to clarify the senses, align the spirit, and prepare the heart for sacred moments. Even bathing is scented, the water perfumed so that every drop feels like an offering. Lips and cheeks glow with the colors of the earth, tints from beetroot, saffron, and crushed rose petals. Teeth are cleaned with neem twigs and charcoal, their care timed with the phases of the moon to maintain harmony between body and nature. And then there is Mendi, henna, winding its way across hands and feet in intricate designs during weddings and festivals. The deep red stains speak of joy, fertility, and transformation. Each swirl and curve is a story, carried proudly on the skin until it fades like a blessing absorbed. Far across the sea, in the marble and olive groves of ancient Greece, beauty is not just personal, it is moral. A well-proportioned face or a sculpted body is thought to reflect a soul in harmony, favored by the gods. Pale skin is the standard, a sign you live free from the labors of the sun. Women dust their faces with powders made from chalk, crushed seashells, or white lead, layering it so finely that it sometimes cracks when they smile. Lips and cheeks are tinted lightly with mulberries, wine sediment, or red ochre. The goal is a modest, healthy glow, for heavy cosmetics are frowned upon. Hair is treated like a crown. Worn long, wavy, and gathered into braids or elegant knots. It is fastened with ivory or bronze pins. Blondes are idealized, and hair is lightened with vinegar, lemon juice, or ash. Among the wealthy, wigs and hairpieces, often taken from women in distant lands, add length and volume. Eyebrows are as telling as the eyes. A continuous brow, the unibrow, is prized as a sign of intelligence and purity. Women without one will draw it in with powdered antimony or soot, even gluing fine hairs between the brows to achieve the look. Perfumes of olive oil infused with thyme, marjoram, and iris root are smoothed into the skin after the daily bath, the scent mingling with the warm air as a quiet declaration of refinement. And then, in the deep jungles and towering temples of Mesoamerica, beauty takes a bold and fearless form. Among the Mayans and Aztecs, the body itself becomes a canvas for devotion, identity, and power. From infancy, noble children have their skulls gently shaped with wooden boards, elongating the head into a smooth, elegant slope, a mark of intelligence and status. Smiles are transformed into treasures. Elites drill tiny holes into their teeth and set in jade, turquoise, or hematite, each stone held fast with natural resins. When sunlight catches these gems, their mouths flash with brilliance. Others file their teeth into sharp points or patterned edges, mimicking the traits of revered animals, symbols of strength, cunning, and divine favor. Color covers the skin with purpose. Red pigments, often from cochineal insects, signal life and fertility, while black designs mark war, devotion, or sacred ritual. Both men and women wear these pigments, their faces and bodies painted for ceremonies that unite the living with the gods. Piercings and tattoos go beyond decoration. They are offerings, vows, and emblems of belonging. From the scented oils of India to the powdered faces of Greece, from the jade-studded smiles of the Maya to the painted brows of Chinese empresses, beauty has always been more than surface deep. It is protection, identity, and power, a language spoken through color, texture, and ritual. And as you drift into sleep, you can almost hear the soft echo of jade rollers, the rustle of silk hairpins, the distant chant of a wedding where henna blooms red, and the solemn drumbeats of a temple where painted faces greet the gods. You stand in a marketplace somewhere in the ancient world, and it is impossible to miss. Beauty is everywhere, but it is rarely gentle. In Mesoamerica, among the Maya and Aztecs, it could be carved into the skin, drilled into bone, or even shaped into the skull. Piercings in the ears, nose, and lips held jade, bone, or shell, not as idle decoration, but as marks of faith, lineage, and status. Tattoos told entire life stories: a warrior's victories, a priest's divine calling, a family's ancestry. Even crossed eyes, achieved by dangling beads before infants so they would gaze inward, were admired as a sign of mystical vision. Travel south along the Nile and across the savannas, and beauty shifts but never loses its power. In ancient Egypt, kohl lined the eyes of men and women alike, not only for allure, but as protection. Made from ground galena, it cut the glare of the desert sun and guarded against infection. The eyes, almond-shaped and heavily defined, were more than features. They were conduits to the divine. Perfume wasn't a luxury here. It was an obsession. Wax cones scented with myrrh, lotus, and cinnamon rested on heads during ceremonies, melting slowly in the heat until their fragrance wrapped the body like invisible silk. After bathing, skin was anointed with palm oil, shea butter, or castor oil, often infused with herbs to heal and protect. Body scrubs of sand and crushed seeds kept skin smooth long before loofahs existed. In Nubia, hair was a crown of identity, braided, shaved into intricate patterns, dyed with henna, or threaded with beads and gold. Further west, among the Yoruba and Songhai, indigo and ochre pigments painted the skin for ceremonies, while scarification marked milestones, beauty, and strength. Yet in every corner of the ancient world, beauty asked for payment, and not always in coin. Some prices were carved deep into the body. Lead powders used in Rome, Greece, and Renaissance Europe could leave a woman pale as porcelain and poisoned from within. Arsenic complexion wafers promised luminous skin but instead brought illness and slow decay. In China, the practice of binding feet, early forms appearing in certain dynasties, twisted them into the so-called lotus shape, a permanent reshaping that signified grace and obedience while inflicting lifelong pain. The Maya and Aztecs honored their gods and ancestors by embedding jade into teeth or shaping skulls during infancy, marks of beauty and nobility achieved at the cost of comfort and safety. Across parts of Africa and the Middle East, scarification cut elaborate designs into skin without antiseptics, risking infection for the sake of cultural pride and spiritual identity. Even the sweetest-smelling rituals had hidden dangers. Egyptian perfume cones, rich with cinnamon oil, could burn the skin in high concentrations, while heavy oils used in place of water bathing sometimes trapped dirt and disease instead of removing it. There were no laboratories to test formulas, no regulations to protect the eager or the curious. Recipes were whispered from mother to daughter, painted on walls, or hidden in guarded scrolls. A beauty secret could be a blessing or a slow curse. And yet, the people who risked their bodies for beauty did so with purpose. To them, it was never just about attraction. Beauty was a reflection of the divine, a statement of power, a declaration of belonging. The scars, the stains, the painted faces, all of them told the same story. In every age, beauty has been a language, and like any language, it can both charm and wound. As you drift into the soft edges of sleep, imagine those distant streets and temples, the scent of myrrh on warm skin, the gleam of gold in a braided crown, the quiet resolve in the eyes of someone who has paid dearly for the privilege of being called beautiful. You're sitting in a dimly lit room in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, and before you is no ordinary game board. It's a relic, a treasure, a cosmic map disguised as entertainment. Over 4,500 years ago, people here gathered around the royal game of Uar, its 20 squares gleaming with lapis lazuli, shell, and red limestone set into a bed of dark bitumen. It was small enough to carry, yet grand enough to belong in the hands of kings and priests. On the surface, the rules were simple. Move your 7 pieces from one end to the other using 4-sided dice shaped like tiny pyramids. But beneath that simplicity ran an undercurrent of symbolism. The path across the board was believed by some to mirror the soul's journey, threading through fate, chance, danger, and divine judgment. Certain squares were blessed, others cursed, and every move felt like stepping onto an invisible bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Clay tablets from later periods hint at an even deeper use, divination. Throw the dice, read the result, and you weren't just making your next move, you were consulting an oracle. In this way, the game blurred the line between play and prophecy. And it traveled. Boards have been found far from Mesopotamia, in places like Egypt and India, proof that it may have been the world's first truly international game, carried along trade routes and adapted by many cultures. For the Sumerians, though, it was never just a pastime. It was rehearsal for eternity. Farther west, in the land of the pharaohs, another game held a similar weight, Senet. This wasn't just an idle diversion painted onto tomb walls for amusement in the afterlife. To the Egyptians, Senet was the soul's voyage through the Duat, the mysterious underworld. Its 30 squares, laid out in 3 rows of 10, were more than just spaces. They were checkpoints in a sacred journey, rebirth, trial, purification, and the weighing of the heart. Movement came not from numbered dice but from sticks or bones cast like primitive lots. Strategy mattered, but so did fortune, for each throw could shift the tide between salvation and peril. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, Senet boards were adorned with protective deities and spells. Square 26, the House of Rebirth, promised safe passage. Land on the wrong square, and you might face delay or spiritual danger. The game became a prayer in wood and paint, played under the watch of Maat, goddess of truth and cosmic balance. Win, and you symbolically earned your place in the afterlife. Lose, and you'd better have packed charms for the journey ahead. Then, in the bustling courtyards and shaded porticos of ancient Greece, a different game captured hearts and hands, knucklebones. At first glance, it looked simple, just tossing the small ankle bones of sheep or goats, catching them in midair, or landing them in specific patterns. But these astragaloi were more than toys. Their uneven sides made each throw unpredictable, and that uncertainty turned the game into a dance between skill and fate. Children played for fun, soldiers for wagers, and lovers for flirtation. Temples saw their share of the game too, as offerings of knucklebones were left for gods and goddesses, their falls interpreted as omens. Each clatter across stone or packed earth was more than noise. It was the sound of luck being tested, of fortunes shifting in the space between a catch and a drop. From the jeweled boards of Mesopotamia to the cedar-painted paths of Egypt, from Greek marketplaces echoing with laughter to the solemn hush of temples, these games carried more than competition. They held the weight of belief. To play was to gamble not just with points or pieces, but with destiny itself. And as you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it, the rattle of ancient dice, the murmur of strategy whispered between friends, the sudden hush when a throw feels fated. In every age, games were never just games. They were stories told in moves and counter-moves, small rehearsals for life, death, and the mysteries that wait beyond. You're standing in an Athenian courtyard, sunlight spilling over marble walls, and the sound you hear is the quick clatter of knucklebones hitting stone. They fall, bounce, and spin before a pair of nimble hands snatches them midair. This is no idle child's play, though children played it too. In Greece, astragaloi was as much about grace as it was about chance. Vase paintings show young women in flowing robes crouched in concentration, the bones dancing between their fingers like living pieces of fate. Each side of the bone had a name and a value, and the throws weren't just tallies, they were omens. A perfect cast, known as the Venus throw, was said to carry divine favor, a silent nod from gods like Apollo or Hermes. Lovers used it as a playful courtship display, warriors tested their reflexes with it, and priests could turn it into a tool for divination. Even in death, the game endured. Knucklebones were tucked into graves, as if the dead might still play, or perhaps use them to read the patterns of the afterlife. Over time, bone gave way to bronze, glass, and ivory, but the essence remained, an elegant blend of play, ritual, and the eternal human fascination with luck. Now shift to a Roman villa, where another game unfolds, not of chance, but of pure intellect. Ludus Latrunculorum, the game of little soldiers, was Rome's answer to war without bloodshed. Played on a checkered grid, each player commanded an army of identical pieces, their goal to surround and capture the enemy. There were no dice, no prayers to fortune here. Victory belonged to the sharper mind. A single careless move could see your line broken, your mercenaries outflanked. It was loved by generals, philosophers, and merchants alike. Archaeologists have found boards carved into stone steps, tiled into courtyards, and even scratched into rooftops, proof that it crossed every boundary of class. Some boards featured fortified squares, perhaps granting special power to the piece that claimed them. Roman poets used the game as a metaphor for politics. Lose a piece, lose influence, get surrounded, suffer betrayal. For soldiers on far-flung frontiers, it was both training for strategy and a reminder of home. And though its rules have faded into speculation, its spirit lives on in games like chess, tests of foresight where triumph is earned, not given. But centuries before these contests of skill, Egypt had a game that was almost pure myth in motion. Mehen, the serpent game. The board was carved in the shape of a coiled snake, its body segmented into dozens of spaces spiraling toward its head. Mehen, the protective serpent god, guarded Ra during his perilous nightly journey through the underworld. To play was to guide your pieces through this winding path, reenacting a divine voyage of danger, renewal, and cosmic order. The playing pieces were just as symbolic, small lion figures and smooth marbles, their exact roles still debated. Were the lions protectors? Predators? Obstacles to be outmaneuvered? Movement may have been decided by casting sticks or throwing knuckle-like pieces, each turn a step deeper into the serpent's coils. Every segment of the snake's body might have been a trial, some granting safety, others threatening loss. What makes Mehen so captivating is its mystery. The rules are lost, but the meaning lingers. It wasn't merely a contest between players, it was a ritual journey mapped in wood and stone. To reach the serpent's head may have symbolized survival through the underworld, Victory not just on the board but in the eternal cycles of life and death. And so, from the bone-tossing courtyards of Athens, to the war tables of Rome, to the sacred spirals of Egypt, ancient games were more than entertainment. They were mirrors of the worlds that made them, blends of skill, chance, and belief. They taught reflex and cunning, whispered omens, reenacted cosmic dramas. And when you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it, the clink of ivory counters, the rattle of bones, the scrape of a lion piece sliding along the serpent's back, each move a step closer to victory or to the god's mysterious will. You sit in the shadow of the Old Kingdom's pyramids, watching a serpent coil across a carved board, its body segmented into squares, its head poised at the center. This is Mehen, a game that once wound its way through Egyptian life like the very creature it depicted. To play it was to step into the serpent's divine spine, reenacting its knightly duty of guarding the sun god Ra as he journeyed through the underworld. Each move across its scales carried the weight of risk, protection, and transformation. Players moved marbles and lion-shaped pieces along the serpent's back. Were the lions allies, guardians, or hunters? The truth is lost to the centuries, and that mystery only deepens the game's pull. Mehen spread beyond Egypt. Spiral boards have been unearthed in Cyprus and the Levant, but whether it kept its cosmic meaning or became just a clever puzzle in foreign hands, we cannot say. Then, suddenly, it vanished. By the Middle Kingdom, it was gone, replaced in ritual life by Senate. Some say its religious symbolism fell out of favor. Others believe new spiritual paths simply eclipsed it. What remains are the boards, silent and beautiful, like relics from a dream no one can fully recall. Now picture a smoky longhouse in the Norse world, the sea wind rattling the walls. Warriors bend over a grid carved into wood or antler, their minds locked in battle. This is Tafel, the king's table. Unlike games of equal sides, here one player is outnumbered 2-1. In the center sits the king with his small band of defenders. On the edges, the attackers close in. The king's goal? Escape to the safety of a corner square. The attacker's mission? Surround him on all sides and end his reign. No dice. No luck. Only logic, nerve, and foresight. To play Tafel well was to think like a commander, knowing when to strike, when to sacrifice, and when to retreat into cunning. The wealthy played on boards inlaid with glass and bone, their pieces carved into warriors or dragons. Soldiers carried simpler sets carved into stone or whalebone, easily packed onto a longship. It was more than amusement, it was training for ambushes, raids, and survival. Even Christian missionaries saw its appeal, sometimes swapping the king piece for a bishop to ease their message into pagan halls. But as chess swept into Scandinavia, Tafel faded, leaving behind echoes in a few surviving regional games. Travel now to the opulent courts of India, where incense drifts through the air and the sound of cowrie shells clinking against stone signals the start of Pachisi. Dating back at least to the 6th century CE, it was a favorite of emperors, and none more so than Akbar the Great. The board, shaped like a giant cross, symbolized the 4 directions and the meeting point of destiny at its center. Each player's pieces traveled the arms of the cross, circling back to their home square. Movement was dictated not by dice but by the number of shells landing open side up, chance woven with choice. It was a game of capture and return. Land on an opponent's piece, and you sent it all the way back to the start. In a courtly version of war, patience was as deadly as aggression. Akbar elevated the game into spectacle, building a massive Pachisi courtyard at Fate per Sikri where living players, dressed in colored robes, stood in for the tokens. From above, he directed them like a general moving armies, an act of politics, performance, and cosmic theater all at once. Pachisi was more than a race to the finish. The cross-shaped design reflected deeper spiritual layers, the meeting of dharma, duty, artha, prosperity, kama, desire, and moksha, liberation. Every move on the board became a small enactment of life's greater game, where victory lay in knowing when to advance, when to wait, and when to strike. From the serpent spirals of Egypt, to the icy battlefields of Viking Tafel, to the living game boards of Mughal India, these were not just games. They were stories you could touch, strategies you could breathe, rituals you could play. And as your mind drifts towards sleep, you can almost feel your hand resting on a carved piece, ready to make the next move, not just in the game before you, but in the endless one life plays with us all. You step into the heart of an ancient Indian court, where the scent of incense mingles with the murmurs of nobles and the sharp clink of cowrie shells. This is Pachisi, a game that demanded more than skill. It asked for harmony with the great rhythm of the universe. A good player understood that winning wasn't only about strategy, but about moving in step with destiny itself, balancing boldness with patience. Later, when outsiders adapted it into the simpler game of Ludo, its rich symbolism was flattened. But in its original form, Pachisi was a masterpiece, an unfolding parable of karma, duty, and the delicate art of timing one's steps in life. Travel across oceans to the bustling plazas and temple steps of the Aztec world, where another game carried the heartbeat of a people, Patali. To the untrained eye, it looked like a simple race on a cross-shaped grid. But to the Aztecs, it was a living universe carved into 52 spaces, reflecting the sacred cycle of their calendar. Every move was an agreement with fate. 6 beans, marked with dots, clattered to the ground to decide your path. Land on your rival's piece, and you might send them back to the beginning, or remove them from the game entirely. Patali was more than play. It was risk wrapped in ritual. Players wagered blankets, gold dust, jade, even their own freedom. High-stakes games drew crowds, their voices rising in cheers or groans with every throw. Priests often presided, ensuring not only fairness but spiritual alignment, for the god Mekuxikitl, patron of games and excess, was always watching. Lose, and perhaps you'd anger him. Win, and you might feel his fleeting favor. The Spanish, arriving with their own notions of morality, outlawed it and destroyed boards wherever they found them. Yet the game lived on in whispers, reshaped into forms safe from the gaze of authority. Across the ancient world, games like these weren't distractions from life, they were miniature reflections of it. In Egypt, Senate boards lay in the tombs of pharaohs, not as idle amusements but as guides for the soul through the perilous halls of the afterlife. Winning wasn't about defeating another person, it was proof that you were spiritually ready for what lay beyond. In Mesoamerica, Patali carried the same divine oversight. Every toss of the beans was a question to the gods, every landing square an answer, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse. Even games that seem abstract to us now held layers of meaning. The Egyptian mehen was a serpent's body uncoiling under your hands, each move reenacting Ra's dangerous journey through the underworld. Pachisi's cross-shaped board mapped the interplay of dharma, prosperity, desire, and liberation. To play them was to rehearse life's trials and triumphs. And in the training of minds, games were weapons of a different kind. The Roman ludus latrunculorum and the Viking tafel weren't idle pastimes. They were classrooms for commanders. Here, nobles and soldiers learned to anticipate moves, to see traps before they were sprung, to balance aggression with restraint. The board was the battlefield without blood, a place where leaders could be forged in silence. From the sacred steps of a temple to the smoky corner of a longhouse, games amused, taught, judged, and prepared. They bound humans to their gods, players to each other, and the present moment to eternity. When you sat before one, you weren't escaping reality, you were stepping into its deepest patterns. And as you picture those ancient players now, leaning over their boards by torchlight or under the open sky, you can feel it. The pulse of something older than victory, older than loss. The eternal game we've all been playing since the first pieces were carved and the first move was made. You arrive at the edge of a story where brilliance and tragedy are intertwined from the very first breath. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin entered the world in 1797 carrying the weight of 2 revolutions, one political, one personal. Her parents were not ordinary dreamers. They were incendiary minds who challenged the order of their time. Her mother, a fearless advocate for women's rights, believed with unshakable conviction that women were not ornaments for the home but thinkers, capable of shaping the world. Her father, a political philosopher, rejected the comfort of tradition, daring to imagine a society built without kings, without the chains of blind religion, without the cold script of arranged marriage. But before Mary could even know her mother's face, death claimed her. 11 days after Mary's birth, she was gone, leaving behind only her writings, a voice preserved in ink. Raised in a home where ideas roamed freely and books were as common as bread, Mary grew up in the shadow of that absent presence. Her father made no attempt to hide her mother's works, instead placing them in her hands as if to say, "This is where you come from. This is the fire you carry." By the time other children were learning to write their names, Mary was absorbing the myths of Greece, the theories of science, and the sharp edges of Enlightenment philosophy. Yet this home of ideas was no perfect haven. Her father remarried, and her relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clairmont, was tense, even cold. The new Mrs. Godwin favored her own children, while Mary, fiery, imaginative, and resistant to domestic obedience, felt like an unwelcome storm in the household. She turned inward, finding solace in the worlds she created with pen and ink. By 10, she was inventing her own tales. By 14, she was reading works that would intimidate most grown men. She was never meant to be confined to embroidery hoops or polite silence. These early years, shaped by revolutionary ideals and sharpened by personal loss, built the foundation of a life destined to defy expectations. She was not simply the daughter of radicals. She was a gathering force in her own right. At 16, that force broke free. Mary ran away, and not alone. She left England with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, a man 5 years her senior, already married, and already a figure of controversy. He admired her father, but it was Mary herself, quiet yet burning with curiosity, who captured him. They shared a hunger for ideas, for freedom, for the unknown. Their most intimate conversations unfolded in a graveyard, beside her mother's tomb, where they read together under the fading light of day. The elopement was reckless, Mary, Percy, and her stepsister Claire Clairmont crossing the channel to France with little money and no clear plan. Percy abandoned his pregnant wife, a choice that would haunt them all. They wandered through a Europe still shadowed by revolution, scribbling in journals by day, sleeping in bare inns by night. Funds ran dry quickly, and when they returned to England, it was in disgrace. Mary's father, the once champion of free love, shut his door to her. Hardship followed like a tide that would not recede. Percy's debts piled up. Their first child died within weeks, and Mary's grief took root deep in her soul. In her journal, she recorded dreams of holding the baby again, only to wake and remember the loss. Yet in this grief, her mind did not dim, it sharpened. She devoured works on alchemy, ancient myth, and the new science of galvanism. Her love for Percy was a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion. He was erratic, brilliant, often distant, but always urging her to write. By 1816, Mary's path carried her to the shores of Lake Geneva, where a strange summer awaited. She, Percy, Claire, the infamous Lord Byron, and Byron's physician, John Polidori, gathered at the Villa Diodati. The world itself seemed dimmed that year. The eruption of a distant volcano had choked the skies with ash, turning days cold and gray. It was the year without a summer. Confined indoors by relentless rain, the group turned to ghost stories and late-night debates on science, the supernatural, and the power of the human imagination. One night, Byron proposed a challenge. Each would craft their own tale of horror. The poets and the physician embraced the game, but Mary, just 18, surrounded by celebrated men, remained silent, waiting for the right spark. Days passed before it came, sudden and vivid, born from a waking dream. That moment would change not only her life, but the course of literature itself. You find yourself in the dim candlelight of a lakeside villa, the rain still clawing at the windows, when the conversation turns to a strange, unsettling idea: galvanism, the use of electricity to jolt dead tissue back into motion. It is here, in this charged atmosphere, that something strikes Mary like a lightning bolt to the mind. That night, sleep is no refuge. She sees, with startling clarity, a young man bent over a figure he has stitched together, his face lit by the fever of forbidden knowledge. Before him lies a shape, human yet not, its stillness trembling on the edge of breath. She wakes knowing she has been given a story. From that vision would emerge Frankenstein, a tale not merely of horror, but of science, myth, and grief woven together. Victor Frankenstein's relentless pursuit of life mirrors an age intoxicated by new discoveries, while his abandoned creation reflects the deep ache of isolation, a loneliness Mary knew all too well. Loss, guilt, and the fragile bonds between creator and creation seep into every page. When the novel appeared in 1818, it bore no name. Many assumed Percy Shelley had written it. After all, he had penned the preface and he was the husband, the man. But truth is not so easily buried. In time, the world would recognize Mary Shelley not as a shadow of another writer, but as the mother of science fiction. Yet this great birth was followed by relentless loss. Returning to England, Mary and Percy were met not by triumph but by tragedy. Their children Clara and William were claimed by illness in quick succession. Dysentery in Italy, then malaria. The grief hollowed her. In her journal, she confessed she could not be comforted. Her health faltered, and darkness settled over her days. Only in 1819 did a fragile joy arrive. Her son, Percy Florence Shelley. He would be her anchor in the years ahead, though even he could not shield her from the next storm. In 1822, death struck with cruel suddenness. Percy Shelley drowned in a squall off the Italian coast, his body unrecognizable save for a small book of poetry in his pocket. Mary was just 24, widowed, impoverished, and carrying more ghosts than most people would ever meet in a lifetime. By then, she had endured the deaths of 3 children, her half-sister Fanny's suicide, and the tragic end of Percy's first wife, Harriet. Reality had become more gothic than any fiction she could pen. Still, she did not break. She gathered Percy's remains, his words, his reputation, and, some whispered, even a fragment of his heart, and guarded them fiercely. Grief was no longer an intruder in her life. It had become her constant companion, and strangely, her muse. She poured it into her writing, Valperga, a sweeping historical novel, The Last Man, a haunting vision of a plague-ravaged world that seemed to echo her own desolation. And she worked tirelessly to preserve Percy's poetry, ensuring his voice would not fade with the tide. By her late 20s, Mary Shelley was living in a solitude few young women of her time could imagine. She had buried her parents, her husband, her children, and much of her youth. What remained was her pen, her son, and the heavy mantle of legacy. Financially precarious, she leaned on her writing for survival. Yet in Victorian England, a woman with such a scandalous past was not welcomed easily. Publishers wanted her work softened, her voice restrained. Mary adapted, not by surrendering her intellect, but by navigating the world with deliberate care. She wrote novels steeped in exile, moral struggle, and the loss of mothers, tales shaped by her shifting perspective, less idealistic now, yet no less profound. She traveled, she kept journals, she edited, and she protected her privacy as if it were a fortress. Proposals of marriage came and went. She refused them all. She guarded her son from the public's prying eyes, giving him the stability she had been denied. And so Mary Shelley endured, not as a figure defined by one novel, but as a survivor who transmuted loss into literature, who understood that sometimes the monsters we create are only mirrors of the wounds we carry. You stand at the closing chapters of Mary Shelley's life, and what you see is not defeat. It is endurance carved into the shape of a woman. Illness had settled into her body, sometimes stealing movement from her arm, sometimes clouding her days with pain. Yet the ink still flowed. She kept writing, kept thinking, kept carrying the same fierce spark that had stared down tragedy and refused to go quiet. By her 30s, Mary was no longer just the widow of a poet or the daughter of political firebrands. She had become something rarer, a quiet, unshakable force in literature. Frankenstein had begun its life as a strange, unsettling story, dismissed by some and misunderstood by many. Critics questioned it, audiences couldn't look away, and the tale began to grow beyond her control. Stages across Europe took up her creation, twisting it into a mute, lumbering brute far from the complex soul she had imagined. Still, the fact that it lived, outside her pages, in the mouths of actors and the minds of strangers, proved its power. Her monster had escaped into the world, and in doing so, had birthed something entirely new. Without seeking the title, Mary Shelley had laid the foundations of science fiction. Long before later giants of the genre, she had asked the question that chills across centuries. What happens when humanity dares to take the place of the divine? But she never claimed the crown. Mary rarely sought the spotlight, yet her work quietly redefined what stories could be. She wove the fears and fascinations of her time, science, morality, motherhood, mortality, into narratives that still breathe today. Her vision reached far beyond Frankenstein. In The Last Man, she imagined a world stripped bare by plague and loneliness, a reflection of her own grief and an eerie prelude to fears the modern world would one day understand all too well. Even as her health faltered, she remained fiercely engaged with the world. Her pen was her way of reaching beyond the confines of her body, influencing thought, shaping public imagination. Her legacy had already slipped free of her grasp, making its way into culture like an electric current, unstoppable, unending. Yet for all her public influence, Mary's private life was a careful, deliberate balance. Identity was her constant battlefield. To be a woman writer in the 19th century was to live in defiance. To be Mary Shelley was to live under even heavier scrutiny. She was the daughter of revolutionaries, the widow of a radical poet, the creator of a morally complex monster. After Percy's death, her position was fragile. His aristocratic family kept her at arm's length, suspicious and cold, offering financial support only under the condition that she remain quiet in certain matters. They allowed her to raise her son, Percy Florence, but made it clear that her influence was to be contained. Mary understood the game, and she played it well. In public, she was composed, maternal, literary, respectable. Beneath that surface, she carried her radical lineage like a hidden weapon. When she edited Percy's works, she softened the sharper edges of his atheism and political fire, not because she had abandoned those ideals, but because she knew how easily they could bury his legacy in a conservative age. Was that compromise or strategy? Perhaps it was both. At the same time, she refused to let her own voice be erased. In an era when women often cloaked themselves behind male pseudonyms, Mary Shelley published under her own name. She would not be a ghost in her own story. She continued to write novels, travel accounts, biographies, always folding her lived truth into her work, even when the world preferred her to be a footnote. Mary Shelley's later years were not marked by the roar of public triumph, but by the steady, unyielding persistence of a woman who had survived more than her share of storms. She had outlived lovers, children, rivals, and critics, and in the quiet she built after so much chaos, she forged something far greater than stability. She forged a legacy that, like the creation she dreamed into being, would never truly die. You reach the final act of Mary Shelley's story, and the air feels different here, quieter, heavier, as if even the walls around her knew they were holding the last flickers of a great and restless mind. Age had not dulled her intellect, but illness had begun its slow siege, severe headaches, weakness in her limbs, perhaps even the shadow of a tumor. Yet she wore her pain the way a warrior wears an old scar, never flaunted, never surrendered to. She simply folded it into her days, letting the rhythm of reading, thinking, and writing carry her forward. Her son, Percy Florence, had grown into a kind and steady man, his life far more conventional than either of his parents. Mary held on to him with quiet devotion, pouring her energy into ensuring his happiness and shielding him from the darker currents that still swirled around the Shelley name. In him, she found a living anchor after decades of loss. Though her days of feverish creation were behind her, she did not drift into idleness. She remained a sharp correspondent, exchanging letters with publishers, friends, and thinkers. Her shelves still filled with history, science, and political theory, she refused to let her mind close in on itself. She kept polishing Percy's works, carefully presenting them to a society still wary of the man's radical fire. Some truths she softened, some edges she smoothed, not to betray his memory, but to ensure it could survive in a world quick to silence the dangerous and the different. The shadows never truly left her. Money was often tight. Loneliness was a familiar guest. And she never married again, not because offers didn't come, but because no one could replace what she and Percy had shared. That love, fierce and flawed as it was, had been forged in ideals and passion, not convenience. It could not be repeated. In 1851, at the age of 53, Mary Shelley slipped quietly out of this world. Her son and daughter-in-law were at her side. Among her belongings, they found tender relics, locks of hair from the children she had buried, and wrapped in silk, the small, preserved fragment of Percy's heart. Even in death, she remained the keeper of memory, the guardian of a story too powerful to fade. Yet her voice did not fall silent. In the years that followed, Frankenstein began to grow in ways even Mary could never have imagined. What had once been a ghost story scribbled by a teenage runaway became a pillar of modern literature. At first, her reputation lived in Percy's shadow. Critics praised her loyalty as his editor more than her skill as an author. Her own works were often dismissed or misunderstood. The deeper questions she had woven into Frankenstein, about science, morality, and the human soul, were ignored by a world not yet ready to look into that mirror. But time has a way of revealing the truths that matter. By the 20th century, her monster had stepped into immortality. Films gave it a face, sometimes far from the one she had imagined, but always carrying its core wound, created by human ambition, cast aside by human fear. Each new adaptation reflected the anxieties of its own time: war, industrialization, nuclear dread, artificial intelligence, and at the center of it all, Mary's fingerprints remained. Scholars returned to her with new eyes. Feminist voices claimed her as a pioneer, someone who had faced down the constraints of her era to tell a story that merged the personal with the philosophical. The Last Man, once overlooked, was seen anew as an eerily prophetic vision of isolation and the fragility of civilizations. Her life, brimming with rebellion, intellect, and endurance, became as compelling as her fiction. Today, she is no longer just remembered, she is revered. She stands as the mother of science fiction, the queen of Gothic imagination, a writer who gave us not only a monster, but a way to speak for every mind that has ever been cast out for thinking too much, feeling too deeply, or daring to question the limits of creation. Mary Shelley did not simply write a novel, she rewired the very DNA of literature. And in doing so, she ensured that her voice, like the heartbeat of her creation, will never truly stop.